Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. In the evolving landscape of Sri Lankan politics, the inclusion of women in political forums and decision-making processes is a critical step towards a robust and comprehensive governance. Now, historically, the political arena in Sri Lanka has been predominantly male-dominated, with women often relegated to the peripheries of political influence. This disparity has undermined the principles of democratic governance and also has stifled the potential for innovative and inclusive policy making. How must we go about challenging these entrenched power dynamics and fostering a political culture that values inclusivity and collaboration by integrating women into the decision-making process? Let's have the conversation. I'm so pleased to be joined by Kumudini Samuel. She's Director Programs and Research at the Women and Media Collective. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening.
I'm also joined by Saritha Irugalbandara, Head of Programs at #Generation, which is a youth-led advocacy organization. Good evening and welcome to the show, Saritha.
Evening. Good evening.
My first question is to Kumudini. Kumudini, just to set the stage, we're looking at an upcoming presidential election followed by a general election. When we talk about the importance of mobilizing the female vote, let's talk a bit about why there isn't sufficient female representation in parliament, in local government bodies, and in the political fora.
Well, female representation, you're right. Historically, we've only had about, 6% or less women in parliament. We've had 4% or less women in provincial government and 2% or less in local government. But in 2018, with the electoral reforms, particularly the bringing in of a 25% quota, we now have 25% women in local government. But certainly, the need for the quota definitely came about because of the paucity of women in politics. And when we looked at the structural reasons for this, we realized that what women didn't have was the opportunity to contest. So we have the equal right to contest elections, we have the equal right to vote, but we don't have the equal opportunity to contest. And looking at statistics up until that point, what we found was, if you look at parliament elections, mainstream political parties don't nominate or give nominations to more than between 2 to 4% women. So if you don't have the opportunity to contest in a country where you have to contest through a political party to win a seat, more or less, in that culture, one of the main barriers is that women don't have that opportunity. So that's one of the things. There are many other reasons why there are less women in politics, but it's oftentimes the structural barriers. Maybe it's the electoral system, it's the barriers within political parties, the lack of internal party democracy, the lack of equal opportunity, as I said, the lack of willingness on the part of male-dominated patriarchal political parties to afford that opportunity to women. And then the voter themselves, we the people often don't vote for women because we don't have an understanding that of the importance of women in politics.
Sure.
So these are many structural reasons and barriers, I think, that we need to overcome, but it's mainly the political parties which are the gatekeepers to the possibility of representation, to contesting and to winning elections that we need to challenge.
Sarita, when we talk about the importance of creating a level playing field for women to get into politics, for women to lead, Kumudini spoke about voter reluctance to vote into office women. And when we break that down, we also see how gender plays a role. Women don't sometimes, and this is backed by research, women don't like to vote for women. And on the other hand, the reticence and reluctance of political parties to nominate women. What are some of the reasons for this?
So maybe I can weigh in on the voters and why there's such a reluctance to vote in women. The way I see it, it's twofold. One, I think because culturally we've not seen a lot of women in power. Like, our claim to fame is that we have the first woman prime minister, and supposedly that is the sort of end all be all for us. That's the statistic we like to tout. But traditionally, but specifically because of the reticence that political parties have in actually nominating women, we also don't see women a lot in traditional representative politics. In terms of the voter and this reluctance to vote in women, I think it's this nexus of culture, religion, and women's role that is often reiterated and reproduced particularly by religious lobbies and other sort of cultural leaders, right? The notion that women's role is to raise a family, to, all these family values, traditions, all of that. So I think for the voter, it also becomes really difficult to create that separation between women are also capable of being in politics, and not just nominally, not just as tokens, but as decision makers at like the top levels of decision making. So I think that sexism is embedded in many forms. I think across the board, when we look at our voter base, and there's this reluctance, even women don't vote for women. That's very true. At the extreme, there's this notion of women can't run a country, women can't do politics, women are not qualified. But in the more implicit ways, there's this understanding of, well, we've never seen women play this role. We've never seen women be in this ministry, run this sort of agency. So we can't trust women. So it's quite cyclical, because if we don't give opportunities to women, we don't know how they would perform. And then that cycle then feeds back into the sort of public perception that since we've not seen it, we don't know how they will do, which is very ironic, and this is exactly why it's sexist. Men have run this country into the ground time and time again, but we don't think the same of women. We never question a man's competence to actually, run a country, run an agency, run a ministry. So I think it's quite this vicious cycle that we're seeing. And honestly, I think based on our demands we've made for system change in the last few years, I'm hoping to see, I'm more forward thinking, hoping to see a change in this thinking pattern going forward, but let's see.
Kumudini, in terms of looking at this from a solutions-oriented point of view, we now have a 25% quota for women in local government. And that amounts to affirmative action. And this is not uncommon across jurisdictions where quotas have been provided for groups that have been either marginalized or disadvantaged. Now, when we take a look at parliamentary elections, female representation is scarily abysmal.
Yes.
How do we bring in the women? Can we look at a quota system? Has this advocacy work been commenced? Is it being blocked, stalled somewhere?
Sonali, this work actually started 30 years ago to try and get some affirmative provisions in place, right? And it took us 25 years to get the quota for local government. The quota for parliament has been much more difficult, because in my opinion, what's happening is that incumbents, and today if you're looking at parliament, we have 214 men in parliament. Those men, incumbents, will want to run again, will want to be nominated again. Now, where is the space for political parties to nominate women then? And that is the reason why political parties are so reluctant. Male leadership in political parties will not take that step.
Right.
To bring in affirmative provisions. I mean, at this coming parliamentary election, we would like to see a parity of opportunity. We'd like to see 50% women given nominations, and it should not be shocking to expect that. In many parts of the world now, parity is what the discussion is. We talk of 25% quotas, we talk of some form of affirmative action, but we see in practice that number is insufficient. We see at local government as well, that number of 25% is not sufficient, that women can win elections. Women prove that at local government. So the first step is, of course, to get women nominated. The next step is for voters to be convinced that they can vote for women. And I think there's no reason not to be convinced. If you're looking at our professional lives, we're looking at from the foreign ministry to say health, to education, to many other professions. Women play a key and leading role. Women have the competencies. At local level, almost all the samitis are peopled with women, and even at leadership level. So why not in politics? And I think that is that, like you said, that patriarchal, sexist, misogynist male mindset that doesn't allow you to do that. And yes, there are cultural perceptions about women and women's role in society, but I think that's breaking down as well. It's not how many of our women just stay home to look after children, which is work. I'm not saying no to that. It's certainly important work. But women play a dual role. They are economically active as well. So why can't they be politically active? I think we can accept that women can be politically active. In this economic crisis, who is the woman who doesn't understand that? Who is the woman who has not been able to manage her household economy? So why not at the highest levels of decision making? Why not in parliament? We, the voters, can vote in women. But the parties must also put forward women. And I think we need to make that demand loud and clear now. Now is not the time for a quota. Now it's the time for serious nominations. And voluntary nominations by political parties. I think that's what we should be asking for.
Sure. Saritha, when we talk about bringing in gender parity, we see how during the Olympics there is gender parity. There's 50% men and 50% females competing in the Olympics, which is fabulous and for the first time in the world. So we see how stereotypes are being challenged as well across the board, from cultural perceptions, as Kumudini alluded to. So also, I'd like to talk about cricket, Sri Lankan cricket, where for decades it was men's cricket that was taken seriously. Women's cricket hardly had sponsors. But now it's getting mainstreamed. Women are getting mainstreamed. But women in the political fore need to be mainstreamed. How do we meaningfully start these conversations? And I want to ask you this from a policy implementation point of view. Yeah, of course, we can have these conversations and it can amount to nothing. I mean, people can maybe tune in and say, yeah, absolutely, women need to be in politics, and then switch off their TVs and go to sleep. But in a meaningful policy implementation, sort of from that perspective, what do we do?
So maybe because this is also a period of elections, maybe I'll start with that. So one thing we're seeing right now is island-wide canvassing, mega, rallies, all of that. With a few notable exceptions across the board, if you look at political rallies, the role of women I'm seeing is to endorse the men, to get your voter base to vote for the men on stage. That seems to be, women seem to be sequestered to that role with a few notable exceptions. So from the get-go, from the election, I think in our political imaginary, then the role is set that, okay, women are there to support the men who would be the decision makers. But we need a flip of this. If we are thinking seriously about women at the policy implementation level, because right now when you think of policy implementation and women at that intersection, we'll find the two very, predictable ones, which is women and children's affairs, right? Whether it's a commission, a committee, women are generally represented in these policy areas. But in the middle of an economic crisis, an ongoing economic crisis, right? Like Kumudini very rightly said, right? Women managing a home economy means that first line of confrontation with an economic crisis, that layer of burden lies with women, which means when it comes to policy implementation, women represent a very, very key interest group in terms of what our economic policy needs to look like, what our policy on child malnutrition needs to look like, what our policy on education needs to look like. Often policy decisions, these are also reflected in our budget decision making. And we know years and years we've cut essential budgets for essential services, and the brunt of it often falls on women. I disagree that women are not politically active in Sri Lanka. I think the personnel is very political for women, particularly in a country like Sri Lanka, where we only talk about women's labor if they are in the Middle East and sending money here, or if they are in the tea estates, or if they are making ready-made garments in Birgama, right? That needs to change. We need to change that. If we are recognizing the role of women in sort of within this economic crisis, within like in this broader political imaginary, then I think when it comes to the policy implementation level, these issues need to be reflected. And that's why I think what Kumudini said, we need women in decision-making positions. It's not enough that they exist to endorse men who would then go on to formulate policy, often without consultation, often without any real grasp of grassroots issues, often without any sort of sense of the pulse, I think, of everyday community and everyday struggles that a lot of people in this country face. And this is true across, I think, all cross sections of society. I think the role of women cannot be understated.
Why is it that being emotional has been demonized so much? Why do we romanticize this notion of the alpha male who is aggressive and macho? Why? It's so toxic.
I think one of the biggest scams that we still fall for is the labeling of anger is not an emotion. We are often taught that anger is not an emotion, but that anger is a state that only men are allowed to be. Women getting angry is a problem. Immediately, if you get angry, there's something wrong with you. You're bitter, you're toxic, all of that. But men get to be angry, and that's the default, and we consider that to not be an emotion. So it's very easy for hegemonic masculinity to thrive, to make anger the default and say, we are not emotional. We are just angry at the state of, whatever they are upset about today. But in terms of emotion, I don't think it's a bad thing either. In fact, I think this is particularly true for many people who are socialized as women. I think when people say emotional, they also mean emotions that display vulnerability, right? That are expressions of vulnerability, and these are inherently somehow seen as weaknesses, an inability to bear things. But emotions are also just expressions, and how we express emotions differ. So I think a lot of the time it's a great way to discredit certain sections of society as unable to take it, unable to remain strong, unable to be resilient, and none of these things are true. I think the Aragale is a great example, right? People were angry, yes, but people were also crying because of that anger, because it was so strong, right? And patriotism is another one. Like often people think patriotism means you never criticize your country, you never say a single negative thing about your country. Even now people are like, we shouldn't criticize the state of affairs because we're trying to become stable, because stability is what we are after. And I think in this sort of gamut, within this sort of context, that's why often emotions are quite demonized. But what it really is that your feeling and your care for something is so big that this is how you express it, whether it's frustration, whether it's anger, anything that is inherently seen as negative. I think if anything, it's a show of resilience, and if anything, it's a show of determination. This hurts me so bad, and this is why I want to change things. This is why I want to do better. This is why I want to see better. And if anything, we should be cherishing that. instead of the more menacing sort of apathy that we see with a lot of men, whether in politics, whether in everyday society, whether among the hegemonic toxic male community.
How important is it, Saritha, for men in politics especially to go to therapy?
I don't think therapy is enough to fix them, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, again, therapy is just a tool. No? At the end of the day, it also requires a level of discipline, a level of commitment to saying,
and
okay,
intelligence.
And all of that, right? Therapy is just a tool. Yeah. But are you going to apply what you learn in therapy and actually change things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's continue the conversation after this short commercial break. You're watching The People's Platform. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
If you want to create your life, create it. This is your opportunity to change your destiny. සඳහි දක්ෂිණ ද්‍රවයට ගොඩ පැසූ අතර මේ ඔවුන්ගේ චන්ද්‍ර ගවේෂණයේ පළමු මෙහෙයුමයි. Gatekeepers with Season 4, Saturday at 6:30 p.m. on TV1.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back. You're watching The People's Platform. I'm in conversation with Kumudini Samuel and Saritha Irugalbandara. We're talking about the importance of mobilizing the female vote. We're talking about bringing in the 52% of Sri Lanka's population into the political fora. Kumudini, one of the questions that is being asked by naysayers is, what do these women bring to the table? I mean, we don't really ask what do men bring to the table. It's always, hey, me ganu මොකටද politics කරන්නේ? ගෙදරට වෙලා ළමයි බලාගෙන කැම ටිකක් හොයාගෙන ඉන්න නැතුව ගෑනු මොකටද අපේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ? That's the kind of question, that's the kind of ethos that we sort of give off.
Yes, that's true. I mean, that's very often, it's very interesting to see who's asking that question, right? And in what tone and with what kind of sentiment. Having said that, I think I also want to say to you that when we're talking about women in politics and voting for women, it's not only the women's vote that has to count here. Men must also vote for women. There's no reason why men shouldn't vote for women.
Absolutely.
And there is also no reason to think that what are conventionally considered women's issues are the only issues that women will bring to the table.
Yeah.
That's another argument that's brought. You know, who is going to raise women's issues? I think men should raise women's issues as well as women, because, you know, if you're looking at the needs, the violations, the discrimination, the need for, ultimately Parliament makes laws. So there are different laws that are brought in, and it's not only when a law on violence against women or a law on family law or something like that gets legislated. All the laws on current economic policy and direction need women's voice, need women's input, and these are also reasons why we need women in Parliament. And if you're looking at Sri Lanka historically, through the years of the war and through the years of the political violence in the late 80s into the war years, you find that women are the ones who came to the fore in trying to protect human rights, in trying to look at issues of the disappeared. Women are still mobilized in relation to the disappeared and seeking justice, seeking truth. Men are also, but women are definitely in the forefront of that. Now, in difficult moments, women have taken the lead and continue to take lead. And I think today in this economic crisis, women can definitely take the lead, bring to the table issues that maybe, or a perspective that maybe has not been thought through or thought of, look at solutions that are practical. I think women as much as men have the ability to do that, and women can bring that to the table. It's that women have not had the opportunity to do that, and I think if you put women into positions of decision making, of such a nature, women will take that role seriously and contribute. Now, if I look at Parliament, not so much in the recent past, but in the previous government, the sectoral oversight committees, the committees that had women in them, the committees that were led by women, did the most amount of work in Parliament, no question.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is actually not known. Now, this is what women will bring to the table, and certainly Parliament needs that. Parliament needs, we have 50% of the population, 50% of the needs of the population are vested in us, and 50% of the solutions are also solutions we have to be part of. So why not? That's a lot of what we can bring to the table.
Absolutely. Saritha, why is it that women are not taken seriously?
I mean, the short answer is it's the sexism and misogyny of it all. I think the longer answer is probably, I think for people to take women seriously in this country, like Kumudini said, it has to be exceptional circumstances where there are certain qualifiers also to see women as qualified to be in certain roles, right? If you look at politics in Sri Lanka, it's almost as if a prerequisite to holding one of the higher echelons of power for women would be to be the widow, right? To be a widow or to be connected to powerful families, you have to have a certain surname. And this is not to discredit the qualifications of any of these women to have been in politics, and not to discredit any of the work they have done. But this is the reality of, I think, the sort of Sri Lankan system. For them to be taken seriously, I think there has to be exceptional circumstances, or B, there has to be certain prerequisites for them to be qualified. Then, not just as women, but the qualifiers sort of precede whether or not they are women, whether or not they are qualified as people. And that is extremely problematic. And this is also a very entrenched part of our political culture. But if you look at Parliament in present day, what you're seeing is one of the things that we have seen personally with like hashtagging in my work is even the level of disrespect that male parliamentarians have towards their own women co-workers. This is a workplace, right? Co-workers. In any other workplace, some of the verbiage that has been used against women parliamentarians is one swift call to HR and pack up all your stuff and go home, right? But these are sitting parliamentarians, these are sitting people's representatives who with utmost impunity have hurled some of very horrific things against women, like very directly and indirectly caught on like hot mics, right?
Yeah.
So that not taking women seriously really comes from, it's a top-down effect as well. We have a population that's seeing this happen on like a live broadcast of a parliamentary session in the middle of a debate flow, debating something very serious, right? And then what you see then in the news cycle, whether it's mainstream or online, is also the target of that news cycle is not the male MP who said anything, but the woman, right? But the woman MP who this abuse was directed at. And there in itself, we are sensationalizing their womanhood and we don't take it seriously, right? There is absolute impunity for people who don't take women seriously and also who derogate, right? And denigrate women very openly. And if this is the political culture that people are exposed to, then there's very little we can also expect from people to take women seriously as candidates. And particularly, I think when it comes to parliamentary elections, now which we will hopefully see sometime in the future after this presidential election, One of the things we're absolutely predicting to see is a lot of harassment, a lot of attacks against women nominees. This happens every single time there's an election. There's a barrage of harassment leveled at women nominees, women candidates. A lot of this would be heavily sexualized, right? A lot of objectification, a lot of misogynistic abuse hurled. And often it's also used as a weapon, as a Trojan horse, to discredit a certain political party, a certain policy line, right? No serious consideration of any of the sort of more policy-oriented statements or decisions that these women are taking, but simply discrediting them because they come from a woman. And then also, of course, the harassment, the barrage of sort of misogynistic abuse that is hurled, often, you know, calling into question their character, the way they dress, you know, all of these unnecessary things. We have so many sitting members in parliament and in the cabinet who have been credibly accused of corruption, of, you know, shoddy deals and all of that. But never is their character called into question if they're nominated, if they're running for political office. So I think there's this like credible double standard that we are seeing in terms of not taking women seriously.
Saritha, I'd like you to connect your answer to also the sexualization and at times fetishization of women in politics.
I think this also goes back to those qualifiers, right? I think for Sri Lankans to take women seriously, either they have to be widows or wives, or they have to be mothers. I think these are the only things that are seen as like the virtues of being able to, am I wrong, Kubi? Like,
Politics.
right, virtues of being credible candidates, of being able to be visible, right? And that's not to say that women who've had these qualifiers, who've also been visible, haven't been on the receiving end of harassment and abuse. Absolutely. But I think particularly now we are in the middle of a very interesting culture war where there's this notion that we've gotten enough gains for women. Now it's time for women to kind of take a back seat, that women being in public is ruining family values. It's, you know, derogating, you know, sort of family values and deprecating certain Sri Lankan morals and ethics and all this. And this is repeated by a lot of gatekeepers of culture, I think, in Sri Lanka. So with this, I think when it comes to the harassment and misogyny and abuse, really what we are seeing is, A, we are completely discrediting their ability to run for political office, but also it's a deliberate silencing, because women also don't want to be visible if this is the level of harassment and hate speech they're facing. And particularly if you look at local government and provincial, right, level elections, local government especially, these are women from communities, right? They know their communities, their voter bases are their neighbors. So if there, let's say there is a campaign of harassment, if there's a campaign of edited images circulating, that's enough grounds for that woman to say, okay, I'm withdrawing my candidacy because this is going to hurt my family. This is hurting my children. This is hurting my spouse. This is hurting my status within community, right? So I think it's from the ground level, I think that harassment, the way women deal with it is different, I think, based on their proximity to power. But really, I think it's also a case of censorship and self-censorship often, because there's not many other good options.
Kumudini, I'd like your perspectives on this concept of gatekeepers of culture that Saritha spoke about. Who is benefited by this subjugation and suppression of women?
Well, obviously men, definitely. And I think in politics, the gatekeeping definitely benefits male politicians. I mean, this is partly why our political culture is such, why it is so patriarchal, misogynist, sexist, and like you said, you know, men getting away, particularly with harassment and sexual harassment, very sexualized behavior. I mean, we've seen this immediately after the local government elections of 2018 in Maharagama, in the Maharagama Municipal Council, in many places, many women who'd won office for the first time saying to us that men were objectifying them, sexualizing them, harassing them sexually. the sexual innuendo, a whole range of things that no political party, to my knowledge, held the men accountable for. And so it's become quite the norm that men can do this. They do this on every election platform where there are women. I mean, there have been years when we've worked with women candidates across the board, where across political parties, women have come together to say no violence, no hate speech, no sexualization, that they in the campaigning landscape, they wanted men to behave. So these are ways in which women have tried to push back on it, but certainly the benefit is to the men. And in politics, it's such a dirty game that men will do anything to win. And so this is very much a weapon and a tool that they use. I mean, surely, yes, women are not, I mean, across the board, I'm not saying all women are perfect. But in terms of this kind of moral high ground that's expected from women, that affects all women in politics, and it's never something that is expected of men. So it definitely benefits men.
Okay. So what needs to be done?
Well,
how do we hold the perpetrators accountable?
This is an interesting thing, because I think, okay, now over the years we've tried to bring in electoral reforms. We've asked the Elections Commission to strengthen electoral laws to deal with, for example, party financing, corruption, violence against women. And this is another phase of that violence in terms of, there is never a level playing field in politics. And how the media is abused, how state assets are abused. And a lot of this is by incumbent men in power. I'm not saying the women don't do it. Women in power use all these different mechanisms as well. But I think the Elections Commission can come up with really stringent laws and accountability mechanisms and ways in which you can hold the candidates accountable, and hold the candidates accountable before an election is held.
Yeah. Over and above legislative reform, what more can be done, Saritha?
I think because we spoke about like party democracy,
intra-party
democracy, right? I think it has to be embedded. Part of that democracy should also be an accountability mechanism, because it doesn't matter that an MP from your party hurled this abuse at a woman MP from another party. This should negatively reflect on your party as a whole, right? So within that sort of ask of intra-party democracy, I think there has to be some level of penalty, some form of accountability, because at the end of the day, I think we look at it as parliament, but what it is a workplace, and this is a policy making body, a law making body. There shouldn't be any space for the particularly the kind of misogyny and sexism we have seen, which directly also discredits women's opinions and thoughts, I think, on the debate floor. So beyond, I think, legislative means, policy means on a national level during elections, I think one of the asks should also be that, I think, from political parties to abide by, some level of, some code of ethics when it comes to the behavior of their party members, because we've seen them take action. It just never happens when the sort of action in question is misogyny or sexism or, harassment.
Yeah, I think the other thing to add on to what you said about changing mindsets in terms of us needing to respect women, it's important that the media plays a particular role in this. It's important that the education system plays a role in this, because we are challenging patriarchy and sexism and misogyny. So it's not just within political parties. We need to change political culture, but we need to change the culture in which we're all embedded. So that's another very important piece of work, I think, that needs to be done, long-term incremental work. But the media has really a critical role here, and very often we don't see the media taking that
Sure.
responsibility.
Before concluding the conversation, we need to talk about these exclusionary boys' clubs and the patronage of male politicians.
The boys' clubs are everywhere. Everywhere where there's power, where there's money, where there is entitlement, privilege. It's all entrenched at some level, and it is very much a part of power. And of course, politics is the play of power, and that's where the boys are. They even in one of the critical things I think for women to get into politics is the question of their social capital, their political capital, and their networking. And the boys network across those clubs. They network across, patrons who will support them economically. Women have much less opportunity to do that. I'm not saying get into corrupt politics, but the enabling of corrupt politics is those networks, those clubs. And that is something, this is all about our political culture. It's a thing that we as voters, we the people, need to also change.
Absolutely. Evidence from various global contexts show that increased female representation in political institutions is associated with enhanced transparency, reduced corruption, and improved governance outcomes. Before we conclude, my final question to both of you: what are the long-term effects of women's political representation on democratic governance and political stability?
I would say we need to change our systems, our political system, the structures, the practice. Just bringing in women and installing them in something that is rotten is not going to change anything. We don't want a part of a poisoned pie. We have to make sure the pie is not poisoned. So I think it's a very systemic thing, I think, from mindsets to political, the way our political system works, the way it's established, the laws, to the practice of it, and then to the voter. And even that is external to the candidate, but the candidate themselves in terms of their personal commitments to politics and the political will to make that change. So it's a lot of things that need to change, I think, and it is a slow incremental process. But it is something, hopefully, at least in the next generation, young people will begin to think differently about the politics and the systems they want and the political culture they want to build. I think what's current and in the past is something that's so terribly rotten that we need to begin to change that. And it is maybe a younger generation like you that has to take that torch forward.
Yeah, I'll just add on to what Kumudini said. I think if we're looking at actual sustainable long-term change, it's also not enough that we just bring women into the fold. I think that's what been the crux of this discussion from the beginning. It's also not enough to just nominally bring in women and say, okay, we've filled a quota or we brought women here. You have to also meaningfully make that into an opportunity to allow women to be at the forefront of that decision-making process. When it's policy, from the design to the implementation stages, you do have to let women make those decisions. And if we're thinking of long-term sustainable change, I think it's also necessary that we also not just encourage and support, but also actively vote for and actively platform women who represent a diversity of interests. Because women in Sri Lanka are also not a monolith. Yeah. So we need to when we say bring women into the fold, if we are serious about a lot of these long-term solution making, it also has to be women who represent these issues from a very grounded level. And hopefully we'll see that change, because I think the demand has also been for system change for the last few years. So for me personally, I'm really looking forward to see that actually translate into whether it's in our election cycles or whether it's what comes after. Super looking forward to that actually translating to something meaningful, or at least the beginning of some meaningful transformation in that system.
But do you both see this transformation taking place slowly but surely?
I think one of the significant things I've noticed after the Aragalaya particularly is while we've not made large strides in women's political representation, we have been able to mainstream political women, the idea of politically active women. And we've also been able to bridge some of the differences, particularly when you think of the quote-unquote national question, right? Like the sort of protests for the disappeared is now more commonly known in the Sinhala South. That's not something we had before the Aragalaya. A lot of people didn't know that there was a protest like this that was ongoing. And now from different sectors, whether it's farming, whether it's fishing, there's a lot of visibility for women we have seen, I think, in the Aragalaya. And like I said, political women and women in politics, I think, are two different things. So I think we're seeing sort of a big surge in political women, and that's something I think we need to celebrate. But if we're going to translate that into actual women actually participating in the decision-making processes, I think that's where the general public, the voter base comes in. That's where political parties come in. That's where all of these other interest groups come in to actually support them in very material and very real, tangible ways. So we are seeing that shift. We are seeing a more broader acceptance of women holding strong, grounded, principled political opinions. I think if Sri Lanka's voters actually get rid of this hesitancy to support very principled women, we might actually see that shift into something more substantive in our representative politics as well.
I think the challenge definitely now in this time of elections is for political parties to begin to nominate, to nominate women, to give women the opportunity to contest, and not in small numbers, you know, as much as possible. I'm saying parity, but really, I don't like to limit ourselves to the 25%, but I would say as many women as possible, suitable candidates that can make a change, new candidates, newcomers into politics, into formal politics. I think that's the challenge we need to throw to political parties today, to say that we as women, and actually we as a people, want to see different candidates and want to see women candidates. So to challenge them to say, not just the incumbents again and again and again, new people in, young people in, women in, that you need to bring these people to the political platform as contestants, and then we as voters make good, informed, educated choices in terms of who we vote for. And that, I think, is the first step towards a change. And also to tell a general population that you have to vote for women. Political parties, bottom line, political parties nominate women and the voter votes for women. I think those are the two things we need to talk about at this election.
Such a fabulous conversation. Thanks so much, both of you. Kumudini Samuel and Saritha Irugalbandara. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next Friday. Good night.